Okay, so before I go into each individual book I read, I wanted to let everyone know that the books I read are books I really enjoyed and would recommend if you're having trouble for any of the categories. Okay, so the first book I read, well, not the first book I'm going to talk about is Anything Goes, which is the autobiography of actor and writer John Barrowman. And his sister, Carol E. Barrowman, also helped write this book. So something I enjoyed about the book was that John went into how him and his family moved from Scotland to America when he was 9 years old. And as one could imagine, it was a big adjustment for the whole family, and him and his siblings had some trouble fitting in with other kids in the country and just in the country in general. And I can relate this to this being my first year at Midpac. And it's also my first year at MPX, and most of you have been in MPX last year, so not only do you all know each other pretty well, you all are used to the curriculum. And at first I was really shy and awkward, which got in the way of my learning. And I'm not going to say the curriculum was outside of my comfort zone, but I did have trouble getting used to it at first. Okay, something I specifically had trouble with was blog posts. And this is my blog post from the beginning of the year and more recent. And what helped me with writing my blog posts was when Mr. Hines would show the class good examples of blog posts, so then I'd know kind of what mine should include. And they're not as long as I would like them to be, and next semester I want to work on making them longer, but I think that they've come pretty far since the beginning of the year. The first book I read this year was Honolulu by Alan Bernert. Another book that he wrote was Molokai, and I read that last year, which made me want to read Honolulu. So Honolulu is about Regret, a picture bride from Korea, and she becomes a picture bride in the hopes that she can pursue the education that she's dreamed of since she was a young child in Honolulu. And on the boat ride to Honolulu, she meets other picture brides who share her hopes for a better life in this other land, but all of their hopes are dashed upon arrival when they learn that the men they are supposed to marry are not only 20 years older than the pictures that they sent them, but they're not rich as they were said that they were. And Regret's husband also proves himself to be alcoholic and abusive. Unable to go back to Korea, Regret tries to make the best of her life at Honolulu, but when her husband's beatings result in the death of her unborn daughter, she decides to run away. Regret is alone for the first time in her life and takes on the name Jin so that her husband won't be able to find her. Along her journey, she finds friends who help her, and she helps them in return, but the most important thing for Regret is that she learns how to be an independent woman with her own mind. I can relate this to group work because I sometimes find it tempting to rely a lot on my partner to do all the work, but I've also found it this year to be motivating to make sure that they don't do all the work and that I help them as a group partner. An example of this was when we were writing our Revolutionary War play, and because we wrote it as 4 scenes with an opening and closing scene altogether, I was kind of tempted to write a short scene for myself and not contribute to the opening or closing scene, but I made myself be motivated to write a scene the length that I think it should be and to contribute when we were rewriting the lines for the opening and closing scenes and wanted to add more information to it. I also volunteered to be in one of my group member scenes, even though it meant more lines for me to learn. This is pictures of the script, and in the end, when we performed our play, I was really proud of myself as a group member and as an individual. I think that working in a group is a useful skill that I will use throughout my education, even after high school. Another book I read was the somewhat romance book, Keeping You a Secret by Julie Ann Peters. So the main character, Holland's life can be described as dry at the beginning of the book, but then she meets Cece, a new student at her school. Cece, despite being tormented by other students because of her sexuality, Cece lives her life, like the sayings on her t-shirts, out and proud. However, when Holland comes out, she is abandoned by her family and friends, and at a point in the book, she is homeless and at a loss of what to do. Throughout the book, she learns to accept herself and find friends to hang out with who also accept her and don't want her to change. I can sort of relate this to how I do research, because when we did our first research project, I found only 4 sources, even though we were supposed to find 8, and one of them was barely related to the topic that I was researching. I just wanted to get it over with and settle for that source. So this is my first bibliography, and it's pretty lacking. When we did our second research project, it was a bit easier for me to find sources, but I also wanted to settle for sources that weren't related because I wanted the work to be over with. However, I pushed myself through and found good sources, and I am proud that my effort paid off and I have a much longer bibliography. I think research is a useful skill I'm going to use even after I'm done with school. My favorite book that I read was Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell. Kath, the main character's life, can be summed up in 2 words: Simon Snow. Kath and her sister Ren have read every Simon Snow book cover to cover, seen every movie, and wrote very popular Simon Snow fan fiction. Kath describes her being twin sisters with Ren as having a built-in best friend, but when Ren decides that she does not want to be roommates with Kath for the first year of college, Kath is hurt and confused. Throughout the year, Kath is distracted by the fact that her sister is practically ignoring her for no good reason, and she's also worried about her father, who's alone for the first time in Kath's life. At first, Kath tries to hide her problems and not reach out to anyone. However, she learns that when she doesn't give up on herself and reaches out to friends around her, her roommate, for example, she learns how to be happier. I can relate this to how I learned to do math. At the beginning of the year, I was settling for 1.5 or 2 out of quizzes and not going to tutorials. When I was frustrated on a problem or a concept, I gave up on myself and didn't try to understand it. However, when I did go to tutorials, I learned that I was perfectly capable of understanding the schematics if I pushed myself and did not get frustrated with myself. Now I understand how to do the concepts, and here's my before and after. It might be kind of hard to see, but this was 1 out of 6, and that is 4 out of 4. Another book I read was Will Grayson by David Levan and John Green. The book is about 2 boys with the same name, but very different lives, who meet by a coincidence. One thing they do have in common is that both of them have tried to emotionally disconnect themselves from the rest of the world. One of them's motto is to not care too much and to shut up. However, throughout the book, they both learn that life is more meaningful when you emotionally open yourself up to the world. Sure, it's easier to get hurt, and that does happen to both of them, but it's also easier to be happy. I learned that I learn better when I'm emotionally connected to what I'm learning about. For example, when we learned about climate change, I learned that I was angry and about the lack of an attempt to clean our environment that was being made, and fearful as to the effect it's going to have on our atmosphere in the upcoming years. Because I had an emotional reaction, everything that we talked about stuck in my brain, and I could still remember it, and don't think I'm going to forget it anytime soon. Recently, I learned that the more I study something, the easier it is for me to become emotionally connected to it. For example, when we first chose our Civil War topics, it was something that I was interested in, but I wasn't really motivated to want to learn about it. However, when I started doing research on Lincoln and the telegraph, and the fact that the generals in the army didn't want to use the telegraph because they didn't want to listen to Lincoln's advice, that made me irritated and made me want to learn more about Lincoln and about the telegraph. And the irritation came in handy because when I was writing my historical fiction through Lincoln's point of view, I'm thinking about fan fiction too much, then Lincoln was irritated in my story, and it was easier for me to portray his emotions when part of them were mine. I think I'm going to use this skill when I go back to the standard program because I can see myself getting bored with traditional learning because I really like the hands-on project-based learning that we're doing in MPX. But I can see myself getting bored with all the reading and stuff. But if I strive for being emotionally connected to the topics that I'm learning about, I think that it'll make it more interesting for me and more easy to pay attention. Thank you for listening to my POL. Are there any questions?
Was that guy from your first bibliography the guy who plays Malcolm Murray?
Yes, that's how I started watching Arrow, actually.
Because of him?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought that you would research him because of Arrow.
No, I've been watching his stuff for a while.
Oh, sick.
Yeah.
I love in the first book you talked about, both what you learned and what your next steps. Hey, shh. I know you guys are talking about something we're talking about, but let's focus on that. Can you talk a little bit more about your next steps on some of the other things? Because I think you gave us some insight about sort of what you want to work on for next semester. And I don't think for all of you that have presented, you've talked about what you've learned, but I like the fact that you talked a little bit about where this is going to take you next or what you want to be able to do. So I'm curious if you have some thoughts about that.
Do you mean like how I'm going to use it later, or how I got to being able to use it now?
How are you going to use it later, or what you think you want to work on next to just improve yourself as a learner? Because you've grown a lot this semester, and that's pretty clear from the presentation. So what do you see your next things needing to work on?
I think even though I've learned a lot of these skills, I want to master them more because I'm not as motivated for a lot of projects as the ones that I've talked about here, because these were the projects that stood out to me and I really enjoyed. And I want to work on being as diligent and motivated for even the projects I don't really like as much.
Other questions?